classify is evident in our earliest written chronicles. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus noted differences among peoples around the classical world. He described Persians, Egyptians, Gauls, Ethiopians, countless different tribes and cultures.
It is very human to ask the question, is this a kind of that or a kind of something else? Humans do that about everything. It's one of the cultural universals, is that people classify. Not only do they classify colors or kinfolk, they classify one another. But how you treat people on the basis of that classification is very different, is a very different question.
The human urge to classify seems innocent enough. So how did we get from there to racial hatred? Classifying people by race, it turns out, is a surprisingly recent phenomenon. When the age of science dawned in the 18th century, it inspired a frenzy of naming and ranking nature. Every variety of plant or animal suddenly received a precise label and a spot in the hierarchy. Around this time, a new notion about people crept into popular and scientific thinking. That all the myriad humans in the world could be lumped together into just 3 or 4 types of people, and the concept of distinct human races was born. The first scientist to categorize human beings by race was a Swedish biologist named Carolus Linnaeus. In 1775, he described 5 human races.
Linnaeus wasn't the first to think this up, but he was the first to make it officially scientific. And in the history of science, Linnaeus's work was so obviously right about the rest of biology that this carried enormous impact into the study of human differences.
To Linnaeus, race in humans meant the same thing it meant in animals, a subspecies, a major division within a species, across which individuals could still breed. For example, the Indian elephant and the African elephant are usually considered to be subspecies of the elephant. But from the very start, scientists squabbled about what should be considered a subspecies in both animals and people.
Whenever professional students of the human species have tried to sit down and figure out what the proper number of categories of humans is, they always come up with a number that reflects both the age, the time, and what particular characteristics they're looking at.
The idea that the human species could be sorted, not by culture or language or even geography, but by a few arbitrary physical features, was a slippery concept from the start. It's no coincidence that the idea grew up alongside European colonialism.
In the age of exploration and colonialism and exploitation and slavery, there were good political reasons for seeing all Africans as homogeneous, to treat an incredibly diverse group of people in similar fashions, overestimate their similarities, underestimate their differences. And that's basically the way the idea of race developed.
While European nations were plundering Africa for the slave trade, Europe's scientists were advancing theories that conveniently justified slavery. Today, most anthropologists agree that Linnaeus was simply wrong. The human species cannot reasonably be divided into a few basic groups.
As far as we can tell, there is no small number of groups into which the human species can be collapsed in nature. What we find, rather, is that there's a simple pattern, at least to a first approximation. People are similar to those nearby, and they're different from those far away. And that neither tells us that there are 5 kinds of people, nor it tells us there are 20, nor it tells us there are 50 kinds of people.
The concept of race came from faulty science. But does that mean race doesn't exist? Over time, people have latched onto the idea of race and given it meaning. Science has abandoned the idea, but society hasn't. Since the categories of race were essentially made up, they're a mishmash of nationality, ethnicity, and physical characteristics. So it's no surprise that no one has ever come up with a reasonable list of racial groups. Take the census. Over 2 centuries, the U.S. Census has tried out more than 30 different racial categories, changing the choices in every single survey.
The problem of the census is really a fascinating one. When this began, we were in an intellectual state where we believed that our cultural categories were scientific ones, and we now know that they were folk categories. And because people were, whether they wanted to be or not, were forced to align themselves in these categories, that they took on a social reality.
And the social reality of race is often chilling. Because along with the notion of race came the idea that certain ones were superior and more deserving of life. And racism's ugly history